Have you ever wondered if your nightmares are more than just dreams? Get ready to discover the shocking truth about Emily and the world of shadows. The rain fell mercilessly on the small town of Shadowgrove, turning its streets into rivers of whispered secret. Emily walked anxiously, her brown eyes reflecting the weight of a mystery she barely understood. Her hurried footsteps echoed through the gloomy streets, her soaked boots splashing water with every movement. Beside her, Liam, her faithful travel companion, struggled to keep up with Emily's frantic pace. "Emily, wait," Liam called, his voice almost swallowed by the roar of the storm. His black hair clung to his forehead, dripping water. "Are you sure about this? Mrs. Winters has a reputation for being, well, eccentric. Some say she's dangerous." Emily stopped abruptly, turning to face Liam. Her eyes shone with a mixture of fierce determination and palpable fear. "Liam, you don't understand. These nightmares, they're getting worse. Every night it's like I'm being consumed by living shadows. I feel like I'm losing pieces of myself. Mrs. Winters is the only person in this town who might have answers. I need to know what's happening to me." Liam nodded, resigned. He knew Emily well enough to know that once she set her mind on something, there was no dissuading her. "Okay, I'm with you. Always. But promise we'll be careful, okay?" Emily managed a weak smile, grateful for Liam's loyalty. "I promise. Thank you for being here with me," she said. The two continued their journey, streets becoming narrower and more winding as they approached their destination. Finally, they arrived at an imposing Victorian mansion at the end of a dead-end alley. The house seemed to defy gravity, its Gothic towers stretching towards the stormy sky like the bony fingers of a sleeping giant. Emily hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling slightly as she raised it to knock on the heavy oak door carved with strange symbols. Liam placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, giving her courage. "We're in this together," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Emily nodded, gathering all her courage before knocking on the door 3 times. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the house itself was responding to her touch. Seconds passed, which seemed like an eternity. Then, with a chilling creak that resembled the moan of a tormented soul, the door slowly opened. An elderly woman appeared, her snow-white hair contrasting with the darkness around her. Her eyes, of such a pale blue they seemed almost transparent, immediately fixed on Emily with a disturbing intensity. "Ah, Emily," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong and melodious for someone her age. "I've been expecting you. The shadows whispered of your arrival. And I see you've brought your protector. Come in, come in. The shadows aren't safe tonight, especially for you, dear." Emily and Liam exchanged surprised and apprehensive looks. The shadows whispered, and what did she mean by protector? Despite their hesitation, both followed the enigmatic lady into the mansion, the door closing behind them with a dull thud that seemed to seal their fate. The interior of the mansion was a dizzying labyrinth of dark corridors and rooms filled with strange artifacts. Ancient mirrors reflected shadows that seemed to move on their own, and the air was heavy with the scent of incense, dried herbs, and something else. Something ancient and mysterious that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand up. Mrs. Winters guided them to a living room, where the fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Sit down," she instructed, pointing to a red velvet sofa that seemed to have seen better days. Mrs. Winters sat in a worn leather armchair, her pale eyes fixed on Emily with an intensity that seemed to penetrate her soul. "You have questions, child. Many questions. I can see the weight of them in your eyes. But first, I must tell you a story. A story about guardians, shadows, and a legacy that runs in your veins since time immemorial." The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength or searching through her memories. The silence in the room was so dense that Emily could hear her own heart beating. Finally, Mrs. Winters opened her eyes and continued, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic tone. "Emily, you are not an ordinary girl. You never were. Like me, you are part of an ancient lineage, a lineage of guardians who protect the world from shadow entities, a legacy as old as humanity itself." Emily felt her heart race, a mixture of fear and excitement running through her veins. "Guardians? But how? Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "And why me? Why now?" Mrs. Winters leaned forward, her eyes shining with ancient knowledge. "Your nightmares, Emily," she explained, "are not mere dreams. They are ancestral memories awakening. The knowledge and skills of generations of guardians, dormant in your blood, beginning to stir. This is how it always happened. power chooses its moment. Liam, who had been observing silently, looked at Emily with a mixture of awe and understanding. That explains why you've always been so sensitive to strange things. The shadows you said you saw moving, the sensations no one else perceived. Mrs. Winters nodded, an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. Precisely, young Liam, and that's why Shadow is so interested in you, Emily. You represent a threat to its growing power, a light in the darkness it so fears. Shadow? Emily asked, feeling a shiver run down her spine as she uttered the name. Hill? Or what is Shadow? Mrs. Winters stood up, walking to a bookshelf filled with ancient books. Her wrinkled fingers slid over the spines until they stopped on a particularly large and dusty tome. She pulled it out with surprising strength for someone her age and opened it, revealing yellowed pages filled with strange symbols and drawings of shadowy creatures that seemed to move on the page. For millennia, she began, her voice taking on the tone of an ancient storyteller. Our world and the realm of shadows were one. Creatures of darkness roamed freely, terrorizing humanity. Fear reigned, and hope was a luxury few could afford. Emily and Liam listened, fascinated, as Mrs. Winters told the story of how the first guardian had emerged. A woman common in many respects, but with an extraordinary gift: power to control shadows themselves. This first guardian, Mrs. Winters continued, used her newly discovered powers to do the unthinkable. She separated the two worlds, creating the veil, a mystical barrier that kept the shadow creatures away from our plane of existence. But the veil, the old woman went on, her tone becoming more grave, is not a static thing. It's a living entity, constantly changing. And like all living things, it needs to be nurtured, protected, maintained. And that's where the guardians come in. Generation after generation, the power passes from one to another, always vigilant, always ready to defend the light against the darkness that threatens to engulf everything. Emily absorbed every word, feeling as if pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed were starting to fit together. And in this generation, she whispered, the realization falling upon her like a weight. Mrs. Winters nodded solemnly. Yes, Emily, you are next in the lineage, the chosen one to maintain the balance, and your awakening couldn't have come at a more crucial moment. What do you mean? Liam asked, hand unconsciously seeking Emily's to offer comfort. Emily squeezed his hand, grateful for the support. The old woman frowned, her wrinkles deepening with concern. She walked to the window, looking out at the storm that continued to rage outside. For a moment, Emily had the impression of seeing shapes moving in the shadows cast by the lightning. The veil is weakening, Mrs. Winters finally said, her voice laden with a gravity that made Emily and Liam sit up straight in their seats. An entity known only as Shadow is gaining power, threatening to break the barrier between worlds. That happens? She left the sentence hanging, the silence more eloquent than any description of the horrors that might follow. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, images from her nightmares returning with frightening clarity. Is that what I see in my nightmares? This Shadow? Yes, Mrs. Winters confirmed, turning to face Emily. Your nightmares are visions, warnings of the approaching danger. Power is awakening, Emily, called by the urgent need to protect our world. Suddenly, a sharp meow cut through the air, making everyone startle. Black cat, almost translucent, materialized in Mrs. Winters' lap as if it had emerged from the shadows themselves. Ah, this is Echo, she said, affectionately stroking the feline's head. My familiar, he helps me monitor shadow activity. A valuable ally in these dark times. Emily, fascinated, hesitantly extended her hand towards the cat. Her fingers passed through it as if it were made of smoke. She gasped, pulling her hand back, eyes wide with surprise. Mrs. Winters smiled, a glimmer of amusement in her tired eyes. Don't be afraid, child. Echo exists between our world and the shadow realm. In time, you two will learn to navigate between these realms, to see what is hidden and touch the untouchable. Liam, who had been absorbing everything in silence, finally spoke, his voice laden with determination. And me? What's my role in all this? I can't just stand by while Emily faces all of this. Mrs. Winters turned her penetrating gaze to the young man, studying him for a long moment before answering. You, Liam, have an equally important role. You are a protector, an essential ally for Emily. Her loyalty and courage will be fundamental in the challenges to come. Every guardian needs an anchor, someone to remind her of her humanity when the powers of the shadows threaten to consume her. Emily and Liam exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. Their hands were still intertwined, a physical reminder of the bond that united them. Mrs. Winters observed the interaction with approval. path ahead will be difficult, full of dangers you can scarcely imagine. But together, you have the potential to do the impossible. Question is, are you ready to accept this destiny? Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a growing determination. She looked at Liam, seeing in him the same reflection of courage and commitment. "We're ready," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear she still felt. "What do we need to do?" Mrs. Winters smiled, a smile that mixed pride and ancient sadness. "Now, my young ones, we begin your training. We have much to learn and little time. The fate of 2 worlds is in your hand." These words, the storm outside seemed to roar with greater force, as if the universe itself recognized the beginning of a new era. Emily and Liam prepared themselves for what was to come, knowing that their lives would never be the same again. In the days that followed, Emily and Liam remained in Mrs. Winters' house, immersed in intense training that tested the limits of their physical and mental abilities. The mansion, which before had seemed merely strange and frightening, revealed itself to be a labyrinth of occult knowledge and ancient secret. Emily learned to sense the energies around her, to distinguish between normal shadows and malevolent entities. Hours were spent in meditation, her eyes closed as she struggled to perceive the subtle changes in the fabric of reality around her. "Focus, Emily," Mrs. Winters' voice echoed in her mind. "The shadows are a part of you, just as the light is. Learn to embrace them without losing yourself in them." Liam, in turn, was instructed in ancient protection techniques and the creation of powerful amulets. His hands, once clumsy with the delicate instruments and arcane symbols, gradually gained confidence and precision. "Remember, Liam," Mrs. Winters would say as she observed his work, "each symbol, each line, carries the power of millennia of knowledge. Your willpower and intention are as important as the precision of the stroke." The nights were punctuated by increasingly vivid nightmares for Emily. Visions of a world engulfed by shadows, nightmare creatures roaming freely, and at the center of it all, dark and evil presence seemed to look directly at her. One morning after a particularly turbulent night, Emily found herself in the mansion's library, leafing through ancient tomes in search of answers. Liam found her there, deep circles under her pale face. "Em," he said softly, sitting down beside her, "you need to rest. You can't go on like that." Emily looked up from the book, tired smile on her lips. "I can't stop, Liam. Every minute that passes is a minute that shadow gains strength. I feel it. Here." She placed her hand over her heart. Liam nodded, understanding. He took her hand, his fingers tracing the newly formed calluses from the intensive training. "We're in this together, remember? You're not alone." The moment of quiet was interrupted by a sharp cry from downstairs. Emily and Liam exchanged alarmed looks before running towards the sound. They found Mrs. Winters in the living room, kneeling on the floor. Echo, the shadow cat, was by her side, his translucent body visibly trembling. "What happened?" Emily asked, rushing to help the old woman up. Mrs. Winters looked up, fear evident in her normally calm gaze. "It's Shadow. He's made his first move. A rift in the veil has been opened in the forest on the outskirts of town." Emily felt her heart race. "What does that mean?" "It means, my dear, that your training will have to be accelerated. The time we thought we had is up." Liam stepped forward, determination shining in his eyes. "What can we do?" Mrs. Winters stood up, her bearing regaining its usual strength and dignity. "You two need to go to the rift and close it before shadow creatures start passing into our world." "But how?" Emily asked, fear and doubt evident in her voice. "There's still so much we don't know, so much I haven't learned." Mrs. Winters placed her hands on Emily's shoulders, her gaze penetrating. "You're ready, Emily. The power is in you. Trust it. Trust yourself." Turning to Liam, she continued, "And you, my young man, will be Emily's eyes and ears, her anchor in the world of light. Together, you are stronger than you imagine." With trembling hands, Emily jumped to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest, the reality of the situation finally hitting her with full force. "It's happening, isn't it? Not just training anymore." Mrs. Winters nodded solemnly. "Yes, my dear, the battle has begun." The shadows in the room began to stir as if responding to the tension in the air. Emily could feel them now, a low hum of dark energy that made her skin tingle. "Remember what you've learned," Mrs. Winters spoke urgently. "Emily, you control the shadows, not the other way around. Liam, the amulets you created will protect you, but your true strength comes from within." Emily and Liam exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. This was the moment they had prepared for, even if they felt far from ready. "Let's go," Emily said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. As the two young people prepared to leave, Mrs. Winters watched them with a mixture of pride and concern. "Remember," he said, her voice laden with emotion, "you carry the hope of two worlds. No matter what happens, don't lose faith in each other." With one last look back, Emily and Liam left the mansion, stepping into the darkness of the night. Full moon hung in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and move in unnatural ways. As they walked towards the forest, Emily could feel the power of the shadows pulsing around her, calling to her. Liam walked by her side, the amulets he had created glowing softly in his pocket. The fate of Shadowgrove and perhaps the entire world now rested in the hands of two young people who, until a few days ago, had no idea of the power they possessed or the dangers they would face. The battle against Shadow was about to begin. Hey everyone, the tension is rising. Emily and Liam are about to face their first big challenge against the forces of Shadow. Do you think they're ready? What do you expect to see in the next part of this exciting saga? Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. And here's a question for you. If you were in Emily or Liam's shoes, what would be your biggest concern in facing this mission? Fear of the unknown? Responsibility of saving the world? Or maybe the concern for each other's safety? Leave your answer in the comments. See you next time, if you dare to come back.